You know how it sometimes feels like synth companies are only remaking the same synth over and over again? When Roland or Korg, for example, drops another virtual analog synth, we rightly ask ourselves, where is the innovation? What's actually new here? Well, if you want something that is at least trying to do something different, here we have the new Polyend Synth. Now, while the name doesn't sound very original, the synth itself has some very innovative new features. Polyend Synth was sent over by Polyend to me, and I will try my best to be objective and thorough in my investigation of it, and I'll talk about both pros and cons throughout the video. And I want to state clearly at the start that the firmware for this is not quite done yet. That's nothing new if you've bought a Polyend product before. Oftentimes the firmware is a bit underbaked when the product comes out, and recently Polyend announced a bunch of new firmware for their other products. So I'm happy about that. We've been waiting a long time for that, so just wanted to get that out of the way. So what is the Polyend Synth? Well, it's an 8-voice multi-engine synthesizer. Think micro or mini freak, where you can switch between different types of synth engines. We have virtual analog, wavetable, a basic FM synth, physical modeling, granular, and even phase distortion synthesis, something I personally know very little about. But there's also a bit of a twist here, because it's also 3-part multi-timbral, meaning it's actually 3 synths in one, and you can play all of these synths at once using the pads. We can change the layout, so there are multiple, as you can see here, different grid layouts. And each of the 3 synths can have its own arpeggiator or sequencer. And there's also a chord mode, which lets you use one synth to control the pitches of the 2 other synths. And since it's 3-part multi-timbral, you can of course sequence the 3 synths using an external sequencer, which I found to be the way I enjoyed using this synth the most. So just to give you a physical overview, you can see here that it's the same form factor as the Polyend Play Plus. But as you can see, the pads are a lot larger. They do have a similar sort of texture to them though, and the knobs feel pretty much identical, the same with the buttons. And in terms of inputs and outputs, it's the same. So we have power, USB, we have the micro SD card, and then we have MIDI in, out, and the output here, which is on a mini jack, but you do get an adapter for that. Now, before we get into the workflow and how to actually use this synth, I want to talk about who it's for. If you find it interesting to be able to play 3 synths at once using the same grid, then this is for you. It could also be for you if you want to have more than one arpeggiator playing at one time and being able to control that, or you need a multi-timbral synth because there aren't that many around this price point. But if you are fine with a more traditional keyboard and you just want one synth and one sound at a time, then a Hydra synth or a Mini Freak, for example, sounds better and are more interesting. So I think you probably know already if this is interesting to you or not. Now, to understand the Polyend Synth a bit better, we need a cup of coffee that I'm of course holding dangerously close above a synth, and we're going to initialize a scene. So what is a scene? Well, it's basically your project where all the information about the 3 synths, what sound you're playing on them, as well as settings for the different effects, as well as settings for the sequencers and arpeggiators and macro settings. Basically everything is in there, so it's like a project. Now for a first sound, I'm going to use the first synth for chords. I'm using the Fat Synth engine, which is basically this virtual analog sound. It's quite basic in what it can do, and some of the other synth engines are much more advanced, but I think it works for a pad. I'm gonna go here to the effects. We of course need some reverb. Oh, a good thing to note is that there's often more than one page, so you can press the button twice. So for the oscillator here, you can see the settings are changing. The settings are dependent on what engine you're loading. The same goes actually for the filter. So the filter isn't the same for each synth. An important negative, there is still these clicks and pops when I'm changing the filter. Now with the firmware updates, this has gotten better, but it does feel like the Polyend Synth is still in a bit of a beta stage. There are still these things that needs to be fixed. If we go to the ADSR, you can see we have envelope and filter envelope. With pretty clear graphics. I will note, however, that sometimes the graphics lag a little bit when you're turning the knobs. This is also something that I like to see improved in future firmware. And if we press Shift and Mod, we can access the mod matrix. For this synth in particular, we only have one option here. We had a couple of options here under filter as well to send the envelope and the filter LFO here, but under mod here it's only one for this synth, but for other synths there are more. So it depends, it's per engine. But of course I will say that would have been nice, for example, to have timbre being a destination in the mod matrix even for this synth. But given that you have so many synth engines to choose from, it's not a huge problem. But of course I would have liked to see basically every parameter being modulatable for every synth engine. But I don't think everyone needs that, but I'm that kind of nerd. So this is the PMD synth, which is based on mutable instruments elements, but with the Polyend's own tweaks. You can do a lot of beautiful plucky sounds with it. So why not use the arpeggiator for this sound? So the ARP has the standard features. We have different types, you can set swing, you can also humanize it. there are also different groove settings. So you can see the graphics changing. This is actually something that I would have loved even clearer graphics for, and in general the graphics are something that I'd love to see improvements to. I know it's something that might take away processing power from other things, but yeah, I would just have loved, for example, these dots could be larger. Now for the third sound. You could go with a lead sound like this and just play it on top of whatever else is going on. Personally, I've found that difficult. I'm not dexterous. I'm not good enough at playing to really utilize it. And I think that this is important to just state outright, that if you're not a decent piano player, using 3 synths at once in combination with doing changes to the chords can feel like a lot. And I do have suggestions for Polyend to get around this and make it even more accessible. More about that later. So using 1 synth as a chord track, 2 synths as arpeggiators or sequencers is how I'm getting the most out of it. But if you have better keyboard skills than I do, which I think frankly is highly likely, then you can just play along with whatever else is going on as well. One of the best features on the Polyend Synth is the Multi-Synth engine. So if I press here, you can see we have a long list here of synth engines to choose from. So let's start with the virtual analog engines, and there are actually 3 different ones: the ACD, the FAT, and the VAP. Now, all of them are just different flavors of virtual analog, and the VAP one is probably the most powerful one. So this is a 2 oscillator synth with noise, and as you can see here, we can change the wave shape of the 2 oscillators as well as the pulse width. And these are of course modulatable. So I showed you earlier that the mod matrix on some synths have very few modifiers and destinations. This one actually has quite a lot. So for this synth we have 6 mod slots. So if we shape the 2 oscillators to be more of a square wave, we can introduce some pulse width modulation here in the mod matrix and send LFOs to the oscillator pulse width. And of course introduce some reverb. And the VAP synth, virtual analog polysynth, shows off the different filters quite nicely. So there's multiple different filter types here to choose from low pass to high pass, and even some band pass ones and notched. And of course the effects play a huge part, so adding some mod effects, basically a chorus, and then feeding that chorus into the reverb does a lot for the sound. So if you want to make beautiful pad sounds, I would go with the virtual analog polysynth. Then there's also a wavetable engine called WAVs. I will say that one missed opportunity here for Polyend is to make the actual engines stand out. So if you look here, it looks very similar in terms of graphics. It's hard to really see which synth I'm using. It just says WAVs up there. So what's going on here? Well, we have 2 wavetables here that we can change. And you can warp them, basically stretching them. And of course, change the position. and add in noise if you want to. And yes, you can load your own wavetables as well. Just put them on the SD card. And I'm not a huge lover of wavetables, but there is something beautiful with the way that Polyend has done this. So here I'm just modulating the warp, the position, and the mix between the two wavetables. And it creates this moving sound. There's also the wavetable FM synthesizer. So this is a little bit different from regular FM synths. You don't have algorithms. Instead here you're using sort of a wave file, I think, at the core, and then you're using different feedback mechanisms to generate the sound. And here I also have a sequence running. Let me briefly mention this. There is an arpeggiator, and then there's the sequencer, which is basically an arpeggiator where you can record in notes. You hit shift to add rests, and then you have basically the same settings as for the arpeggiator. We have swing, groove, humanize, rate, gate length. So let's get back to the FM synth here. We have ratio over here, then we have FM. So if I increase this, we're frequency modulating between the two oscillators. And if I increase the ratio of 1, we get into these more FM-like tones. And while you can make some beautiful sounds using this FM engine, I also feel that it easily gets into very clangy, metallic, kind of noisy territory. So it's good for those kind of sounds, but it's not my favorite engine on this synth. Once you start to turn up the feedback, it tends to get quite noisy, and I don't know if that's because it's at the core a sample-based kind of FM synthesis, but you can make some pretty cool sounds with it. The next synth engine is one of the most beautiful sounding, but it also has some limitations. This is the physical modeling engine based on, I think, Mutable Instruments elements with the Polyend's own tweaks. And you can see here we have a couple of different settings for it. And most importantly, there is a limitation. So you can only do 2 voices max on this one. I think it's just a CPU limitation. Maybe that's something they can improve. And using this with an ARP, is something I really like. And you can get sounds out of it like glockenspiel. Or something more string oriented like a coda. Or just something a bit more weird. The next synth engine is the granular synth engine. This one also has a limitation, so if we go here to synths, it only has 1 voice. There is a paraphonic mode, so you can basically do, I think, 4-note paraphonic, meaning that you don't have individual articulation per note for the filter and the amp, I believe. And because I recently deep dived into granular synthesis, I realized that granular synthesis is very, very CPU demanding. So that's one reason why there are limitations. So we have a sample here. Use this knob here to change it. You can change the position. And there's also randomization for the position here. And we can change the grain size and increase the density. The number of grains being played back. We can find a sweet spot and we can introduce panning of the grains. So this randomizes the panning. We can change the shape of the grains. And add in some reverb. And I think because of CPU limitations, it works best with a synth sound sample, because I haven't been able to really turn like a very short non-synth sample into something that sounds beautiful. So it sounds definitely better with a synth sample. It could be a matter of the grain size not being small enough or the density not being high enough. But if you use a synth sound, you can get some beautiful results. And why not introduce some LFO here to grain shape, position and size. So I'm not super impressed by the granular engine, but I am quite impressed with the next synth. This is the phase distortion synthesizer. And this is without any effects. This actually sounds pretty good. Again, I think that the graphics are lackluster, it just looks like any other synth. So since I haven't dabbled much with phase distortion synthesis, here's my layman's understanding. We start by selecting a waveform. And on page number 1 here we have mix, so I can mix between the two waveforms. If we listen to one waveform, we can wave shape it. Mix in the other one. Change its shape as well. And then if I'm not totally mistaken, and please comment down below if I get this wrong, we have these different types of phase distortion algorithms, I suppose, that you can select here. And then you have 4 parameters here that interact with these different algos, and they change the waveform. I think that's about it. So if I set up LFOs here to modulate the oscillator 1 and 2 X and Y mods. And if I turn up the LFO, you hear the modulation more clearly, but it just adds a subtle change to the shape of the sound. And if I then change the filter and I go here and I change the phase distortion model, I think it is, we get a slightly different sound, or quite a lot of difference actually. So now it's a bit exaggerated. We can turn down the LFO quite a bit, I think. And why not feed the mod effect into the delay? You know I like that, so. So what do I think about the sound of the Polyend Synth? Well, I wouldn't say it's the best sounding digital synth out there, but I think for the money you're paying, I think it will be around 500, 600 euro or something like that. Then it sounds pretty good. It sounds about what I'd expect, and it ranges from sounding great with certain synth engines and effects to sounding just okay using other synth engines. And I think that goes for pretty much any multi-engine synth like the Micro Freak or Mini Freak. Not every engine will sound amazing. Some of them are limited, as I've talked about already, but I do think that the sound and the synth engines are actually one of the strengths of this device. It's one of the things that they have actually nailed. I will say, however, that the actual gain staging and like the levels between the 3 synths can be a little finicky to set up. That's something I struggled a lot with, getting like the levels right, so not just one synth overpowers the others, and maybe this is something that they can improve in future firmware. Now let me briefly touch on the pads. They are not my favorite pads out there. I think the Ableton Push 3 and the Ableton Move, for example, has much nicer pads. They are velocity sensitive and they can do polyphonic aftertouch. But to me personally, they are just okay, and sometimes I struggle to really articulate stuff with them. And let me just show you here in the menu. So you go to macros, and here we have actually velocity setup. So you can actually set up multiple things to be affected by velocity. So you just press select a parameter and then turn a knob, for example, cutoff here, and we can increase it. So the harder I play, the filter opens up. And the same goes for aftertouch or pressure. So you have these slots here, so you can set them up to respond to aftertouch, basically pressing down the pad a bit. But yes, I will be honest and say the pads are not my favorite. Over here we can access the mixer, so the level for the 3 synths as well as the panning left and right. There are also, if we press shift and scene, different synth engines that we can select from, and in the same menu you can also load presets. I also mentioned that there are different grid setups. So if we press here, we go to the main menu, and here we can go to grid and we can change the layout. So there are multiple, as you can see here, different grid layouts. They all function the same way. Each grid layout has no unique properties by themselves. It's just a way of dividing the actual pads. And you can choose to just have all of the pads for playing one synth. But with the current firmware, there is no way of layering the 3 synths and just playing back all 3 synths at once using one grid like this, like you could, for example, on the recent Korg synth, the Multi-Poly, where you can just layer 3 synths, play them back using one keyboard. I also mentioned earlier that it's an 8-voice synth, so if I press the menu, go to synths, so in this menu we can select how many voices we want per synth. So we can have, for example, 4 voices on synth 1, synth 2 can be 2 voices, and synth 3 can be 2 voices. For example, we can also turn off voices and just have one massive synth with 8 voices. So 8 voices is competitive when you look at similarly priced synths like the Mini Freak or the Hydra Synth Explorer, for example, but these aren't multi-timbral synths. And because the Polyend Synth is multi-timbral, which is nice, it also means that I hit the ceiling, the polyphony ceiling, much quicker sometimes. And in the synths menu, you can also select which MIDI channel the synths respond to. And if you wanted to play the synths layered, you could set them to the same MIDI channel and then just play them back from a MIDI keyboard if you wanted to play them layered. In the grid menu, there is also something super important that makes the Polyend Synth unique, but also needs a little bit more work, I think. So this is a chord mode that has a follower function, which means that I can set up one synth to play back chords, and I can then select the follower mode for the 2 other synths. So look here at the grid. It follows along, which means that the notes here are being changed in correspondence with the chords that you've selected. So if we select the yellow synth, and yes, the different colors here correspond to the different synths, and we use these buttons here to select between the different synths. So I'm on the blue synth now, yellow synth, purple synth. Got this FM synth. We go here to the sequencer, we turn on the arpeggiator. So as you can see, the ARP is following the chord sequence. Let's add in the third synth. And we can feed the mod into the delay and the delay into the reverb. if we go to the menu and go macros, you can see it says timbre, movement, and experiment. Now, this is just a kind of a naming convention and kind of an idea that Polyend has, that the first macro knob should affect timbre, then some sort of LFO movement, and then something crazy. So if we go to timbre, you can see it's set up to different oscillator parameters. If you want to, you can also hold down all 3 buttons or 2 buttons and turn the macro knobs. To affect all 3 synths at once. And here are some final thoughts. The Polyend Synth is a fresh take on what a synthesizer can be. On the plus side is an innovative 3x synth grid and a lot of choices in terms of synth engines and sound design. On the negative side is that the synth just isn't really quite done cooking yet, and with some more firmware love, I think that it could become a great synthesizer. But at the moment it feels a little bit like it's still in a beta stage. And there's frankly a bunch of small issues and also some missing features getting in the way here. The first thing is a missing feature that I have discussed with Polyend, and we might not really agree on this. The chord and follower functionality is at the core of using the 3x synth grid. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when I'm playing it, as you can see, it's one of those things that sets it apart from other synths. I can control the pitches of the other synths just using one synth. Now, this is really cool, especially if you're a good skilled player. But if you're a more mediocre player like I am, and to be frank, a lot of people are that are into synths, we like to sequence things. Then we come to what I think is a missing feature, namely a way to sequence changes to the chord synth. When you switch pad, when you press a new pad, this changes the pitches of the other synths. If you record a sequence with the synth that is set to chord, this won't actually change the pitches of the 2 other synths. Because if you play back the sequence, it won't actually change the pad. Even though you recorded a sequence with different notes, it won't change the pad. So you have to manually press a new pad, and then the other synths change in relationship to what you pressed. Now let's imagine for a second that we have a second sequencer, which is called pad sequencer. So this one doesn't store MIDI note data, it stores pad data, which pad is being active. So I could record a sequence of pad changes like so, which in turn changes the notes of the other synths. So why is this important? Well, it just gives you more options. So if I have a chord sequence that I want running all the time and I just want to jam on top of it, I can have that. Maybe I could even save multiple different sequences and chain them together somehow and just jam on top of them using 2 synths or 1 arpeggio and 1 synth. And it also frees me up to actually tweak the knobs while this is going on. So hopefully I've made the case clear that this could be a really fun improvement to this synth. And this ties into another important point I have. The chord and follower mode has to work with external MIDI somehow, perhaps by using this second sequencer that I was talking about. So you could shift the active pad using, say, the lowest incoming MIDI note or something. And what's the point of this? Well, same as before, I want to be able to control the chord changes using MIDI so that the other synths follow along. And at the moment you can't do it on the device and you can't do it with MIDI. So this is just something that I think would make a lot of sense. And a few other quick things while I'm at it. So the whole holding a note or latching a note like so, this could be improved. It can be a little annoying because if I have one here latched or held and I want to hold another and turn this one off, I have to like double press like so. Yeah, maybe a mode where It just deselects whatever you have latched already when you latch another note or hold another note, maybe something like that. I also want the ability to layer sounds, because that doesn't seem to be a possibility with the current firmware. Some of the graphics are still a little laggy. There are occasional nasty clicks and pops when I'm turning, say, the main volume and other things like different filter modes, for example. CPU often reaches max load, maybe it could be optimized further. And I also noted that when the device is synced via MIDI, sometimes the delay, if it's tempo sync, gets weird clicks and pops to its sound, and I'm not sure if this is like a setting. I haven't been able to figure that one out. So when I turn off the tempo sync, it starts working again and doesn't click and pop. So maybe it's just a settings thing, but worth taking a look at. So those were just some of my findings. I do like the Polyend Synth, and I hope they keep developing it, because we need more synths like this that are trying to do something different. And that might not be for everyone, but I'm glad that it exists. So as always, hope you have a great day. Talk to you all later.